Shots rang out across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs, causing Sarah Caldwell to flinch as she stepped off the stagecoach, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird seeking freedom. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new beginning in this frontier town felt suddenly fragile as the gunfire died down, and curious eyes turned toward her, the newest arrival in a place where strangers were rarely welcomed without suspicion. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah gathered her skirts, clutching her worn carpetbag with white-knuckled fingers. Her dark brown hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, but several strands had come loose during the jarring journey, framing a face that bore both the softness of youth and the hardened edges of someone who had seen too much for her 22 years. "Madam, you might want to wait a moment before heading out there," the stagecoach driver warned, his weathered face creased with concern. "Seems Donovan's boys are at it again." Sarah nodded stiffly, but her blue eyes remained fixed on the scene before her. A man lay sprawled in the dirt, blood seeping into the thirsty ground beneath him. Several yards away, a tall figure holstered his pistol with practiced ease, seemingly unbothered by the crowd gathering around the fallen man. "Is he dead?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hard to say," the driver replied, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "But if he ain't, it won't be for Marshal Reed's lack of trying." The name caught Sarah's attention, pulling her gaze toward the tall man who now turned to face the stagecoach. Marshal Reed, the lawman of Redemption Springs. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes that seemed to cut through the distance between them with unnerving intensity. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the dusty street, determined not to let the violence she'd just witnessed deter her from her purpose. She had not traveled over 1,000 miles to be frightened away now. Miss Caldwell. A stout woman with graying hair approached, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. I received your letter about the teaching position." "Yes, thank you for meeting me," Sarah replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I apologize for arriving amid such commotion." Mrs. Henderson waved her hand dismissively. "That's just the way of things out here sometimes. Come along, I'll show you to the boarding house where you'll be staying." As they walked down the wooden sidewalk, Sarah felt the weight of stares upon her. Whispers followed in their wake, and she fought the urge to pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "New faces are always cause for gossip in a town this size." Sarah nodded, but she knew the truth. It wasn't merely her status as a newcomer that sparked interest. Word traveled fast in the West, faster than any stagecoach or telegram. She wondered how long it would take before the whispers about her past reached Redemption Springs. How long before they discovered why she had left her home in Boston. "The school is just down that way," Mrs. Henderson continued, pointing toward a modest white building at the edge of town. "Classes begin Monday morning. The children are eager to meet their new teacher." "I'm looking forward to meeting them as well," Sarah replied, and this time her smile was genuine. If nothing else, she could find solace in her work, in the innocent faces of children who knew nothing of her shame. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was clean and sturdy. Mrs. Henderson introduced her to the proprietress, a widow named Mrs. Wilson, who showed her to a small room on the 2nd floor. "It ain't much, Mrs. Wilson said, but it's clean and the bed don't have bugs." "It's perfect," Sarah assured her, though in truth it was barely half the size of her bedroom back home. But then that life was behind her now. After Mrs. Wilson left, Sarah sank onto the narrow bed, allowing herself a moment of weakness. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had done enough crying on the journey west. Now was the time for strength, for rebuilding what had been so thoroughly destroyed. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. She hastily smoothed her skirts and wiped at her eyes before opening it to find Mrs. Henderson standing there with a basket. Just a few essentials, the older woman explained, handing it over. Some bread, cheese, and preserves to tide you over until morning. You're very kind, Sarah said, touched by the gesture. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her expression growing serious. Miss Caldwell, there's something I should tell you. The school board. They were somewhat reluctant to hire a teacher from so far away, sight unseen. I vouched for you based on your references, but Sarah's heart sank. But they have reservations. Some do, Mrs. Henderson admitted. This is a small community, Miss Caldwell. People here value their traditional ways. They'll be watching you closely. I understand, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. I won't give them reason to doubt your judgment in hiring me. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah unpacked her meager belongings. Among them was a locket containing a small photograph, the only reminder of a past she was desperate to leave behind. She tucked it into the drawer of the bedside table, unwilling to look at the face that had once meant everything to her. As night fell, the sounds of the saloon across the street grew louder: piano music, raucous laughter, and occasional shouts. Sarah prepared for bed, her mind racing with thoughts of the coming days. Would she find acceptance here? Or would her past eventually catch up to her, forcing her to flee once again? The next morning dawned bright and clear. Sarah dressed carefully in her best calico dress, determined to make a good impression as she explored her new home. The main street of Redemption Springs was bustling with activity, merchants opening their shops, ranch hands gathering supplies, and women going about their marketing. Sarah made her way to the schoolhouse, eager to see where she would be teaching. The building was small but well-maintained, with rows of simple desks facing a larger desk at the front of the room. A blackboard hung on the wall, and shelves lined with a modest collection of books stood in the corner. Planning your lessons already? A deep voice asked from the doorway. Sarah turned with a start to find Marshal Reed leaning against the doorframe, watching her with curious eyes. In the clear light of day, she could see him properly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines at the corners of eyes that were a startling shade of green. Mr. Reed, she acknowledged, straightening her spine. I was just familiarizing myself with the classroom. Marshal, he corrected, stepping inside. Marshal Reed. Town marshal, though some folks around here can't seem to get the distinction. His mouth quirked up at one corner. And you're Miss Caldwell, the new schoolteacher from back east. Sarah Caldwell, yes, she replied, wondering how much he already knew about her. I arrived yesterday. Just in time to witness me dealing with one of Donovan's troublemakers, he said, his expression growing serious. Not the welcome I would have chosen for you. Is the man, did he survive? Sarah asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. Marshal nodded. He'll live, though he might think twice before drawing on me again. Doc patched him up, and I put him on the eastbound stage this morning with instructions not to return. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Sarah turned back to the blackboard, running her fingers along the ledge. The children of Redemption Springs deserve a good education, she said finally. I intend to provide that. I'm sure you will, Marshal replied, and something in his tone made her look at him again. There was a wariness in his eyes, an assessment that made her feel exposed. Though I wonder what brings a refined Eastern lady like yourself to a rough place like this. Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. The opportunity to make a difference, she said. Isn't that why we all choose the paths we do? Marshal smiled, a genuine one that transformed his face. Well said, Miss Caldwell. Though in my experience, people usually run to places like Redemption Springs when they're running from something else. Before she could respond, the church bell began to toll, marking the hour. I should be going, Sarah said, gathering her shawl. There's much to prepare before classes begin on Monday. Marshal stepped aside to let her pass, but his voice stopped her at the door. Word of advice, Miss Caldwell, this town has a long memory and not much forgiveness for certain indiscretions. Whatever you're leaving behind, make sure it stays there. Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Reed. Marshal, he corrected again, his eyes never leaving hers, and I think you do. Good day, Miss Caldwell. As Sarah hurried back to the boarding house, her thoughts were in turmoil. Had her past already caught up with her? Or was Marshal Reed simply suspicious of all newcomers? Either way, she would need to be careful around the town marshal. The last thing she needed was for him to start digging into why she had really come to Redemption Springs. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah spent hours at the schoolhouse, organizing books, cleaning desks, and planning lessons. She met several of the townspeople, including the minister and his wife, the blacksmith, and the owner of the general store. Most were polite if reserved, though she caught whispers behind her back more than once. On Sunday, she attended church, sitting in the back pew and keeping to herself. She noticed Marshal Reed across the aisle, his tall frame easy to spot. He caught her looking and nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. After the service, several mothers approached to introduce themselves and their children. Sarah smiled and made conversation, relieved by the normal interaction. Perhaps things would be all right after all. That hope was short-lived. As she made her way back to the boarding house, she overheard two women talking in hushed tones. "She's certainly pretty enough," one said. "Too pretty if you ask me. Why would a girl like that come all this way to teach in a place like Redemption Springs?" "I heard tell she was involved in some scandal back east," the other replied. "Something about a married man." Sarah's steps faltered, but she forced herself to keep walking, her face burning with shame. The rumors had followed her after all. How long before the entire town knew? How long before Mrs. Henderson was forced to rescind her offer of employment? That night, sleep eluded her. She tossed and turned, plagued by memories and fears. When dawn finally broke, she rose exhausted but determined. Whatever they thought they knew about her, she would prove them wrong through her actions and dedication to her students. The first day of school went better than she had dared hope. 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 filled the small classroom, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah threw herself into her role, introducing herself and outlining her expectations with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. By midday, she had learned all their names and begun to assess their various levels of education. Some of the older boys were clearly there under duress, more interested in ranch work than reading, but even they seemed to respond to her patient approach. At the end of the day, as the children filed out, a girl of about 12 lingered behind. "Miss Caldwell," she said shyly. "I'm Molly Jensen. I just wanted to say I'm glad you're our teacher." Sarah smiled, touched by the simple declaration. "Thank you, Molly. I'm glad to be here." As the weeks passed, Sarah settled into a routine. She taught during the day, took her meals at the boarding house, and spent her evenings preparing lessons or reading. She made few friends, keeping most people at a polite distance, but her students began to warm to her, bringing her wildflowers or bits of rock they thought interesting. The whispers continued, growing more elaborate with each retelling, but Sarah held her head high and focused on her work. She saw Marshal Reed occasionally at church or passing on the street, but they rarely spoke beyond brief pleasantries, until the night of the harvest dance. Mrs. Henderson had insisted Sarah attend, arguing that her absence would only fuel more gossip. Reluctantly, Sarah had agreed, wearing her one good dress, a deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. The town hall was transformed for the occasion, with lanterns strung across the ceiling and tables laden with food along the walls. A small band played lively tunes, and couples twirled across the wooden floor with varying degrees of grace. Sarah stood near the punch bowl, watching the festivities and exchanging polite conversation with parents of her students. She was just considering whether she could slip away without being noticed when Marshal Reed appeared at her side. "You look lovely tonight, Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah looked up at him in surprise. He was dressed in clean clothes, his usual gun belt absent, though she suspected he still carried a weapon somewhere on his person. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she replied cautiously. "Marshal," he corrected for what felt like the 100th time. "Would you care to dance?" Sarah hesitated. Dancing with the town marshal would certainly set tongues wagging, but refusing him might be seen as a slight. "I'm not sure that's wise," she said finally, his mouth quirked up in that half-smile she'd come to recognize. "Because of what they're already saying about you," her breath caught. "You've heard the rumors, then?" "It's my job to know what's happening in my town," he said with a shrug, "though I make it a point not to believe everything I hear." The music changed to a slower waltz, and before she could protest further, he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor. His hand at her waist was warm and steady, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. "They say you were involved with a married man back east," Marshall said quietly as they moved around the floor. "That you fled in disgrace when the affair was discovered." Sarah missed a step, but he smoothly guided her back into rhythm. "And do you believe that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the music. "I believe there's usually more to a story than what gossips share over garden fences," he replied, his green eyes serious as they met hers. "I also believe that everyone deserves a second chance. Even you, Sarah Caldwell." The use of her first name startled her, but before she could respond, the music ended and he released her, stepping back with a slight bow. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally, and then he was gone, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the floor with dozens of curious eyes upon her. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find a small bouquet of wildflowers on her doorstep at the boarding house. There was no note, but she knew who had left them. The gesture both touched and troubled her. The last thing she needed was to attract more attention, especially from the town marshal. As she arranged the flowers in a jar of water, Mrs. Wilson appeared in her doorway. "Got yourself an admirer already?" the landlady asked, eyebrows raised. "Just a friendly gesture," Sarah replied, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Wilson snorted. "Marshal Reed don't make friendly gestures to just anyone. Man's been in this town 5 years, and I can count on one hand the number of women he's shown interest in." Sarah's face warmed. "It's not like that." "Maybe not for you," Mrs. Wilson said with a knowing look. "But you mark my words, that man's taken notice, and he ain't one to give up easy once he sets his mind to something." The thought followed Sarah throughout the day, distracting her during lessons and causing her to snap at a student who was merely asking for help. She apologized immediately, but the incident left her shaken. That evening, she decided to clear her head with a walk. The autumn air was crisp, and the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and headed toward the edge of town, away from curious eyes. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. Marshal Reed rode toward her on a large bay horse, his expression darkening when he recognized her. "Miss Caldwell," he called, reining in beside her. "It's not safe for a lady to be walking alone at this hour." "I needed some air," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "And please call me Sarah. If we're to be friends, we should dispense with formalities." He dismounted, leading his horse as he fell into step beside her. "Friends, is it?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "And here I thought you were avoiding me after our dance." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Mr. Reed Marshal, I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not in a position to encourage any particular attention." His expression grew serious. "Because of your past, because of many things," she replied carefully. "My position as a teacher requires a certain standard of behavior. And given what people are already saying about me." "Let them talk," he said dismissively. "I've never much cared for gossip." "That's easy for you to say," Sarah replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You're a man and the law in this town. Your reputation can withstand scrutiny. Mine cannot." Marshall studied her face, his green eyes intent. "What really happened back east, Sarah? Who hurt you? The question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid her. For a moment, she was tempted to tell him everything about Thomas, about the baby, about the terrible choice she had been forced to make, but the moment passed, and she shook her head. "The past is behind me," she said firmly. "I came here for a fresh start, not to dredge up old wounds." He nodded slowly, respecting her refusal to elaborate. "Fair enough. But know this, whatever it is you're running from, you don't have to face it alone. Not anymore." The sincerity in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I should be getting back before it gets dark." "I'll walk you," he said, and this time she didn't argue. They returned to town in companionable silence, parting at the steps of the boarding house with a promise to see each other at church on Sunday. As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah found herself settling more comfortably into life in Redemption Springs. Her students were making good progress, and while the whispers about her past continued, they seemed to have lost some of their venom. She still kept mostly to herself, but she had formed a tentative friendship with Molly Jensen's mother, Rebecca, who invited her to dinner occasionally. And then there was Marshal Reed. Despite her best intentions to keep him at a distance, she found herself looking forward to their encounters, brief conversations on the street, the occasional shared meal at the town's small cafe, even a ride into the countryside one crisp Sunday afternoon when he insisted she needed to see the beauty of the land beyond the town limits. He never pressed her about her past, but she sensed his curiosity remained. Sometimes she caught him watching her with those intense green eyes as if trying to solve a puzzle. It both unnerved and thrilled her, though she tried to deny the latter feeling. December brought heavy snow and preparations for Christmas. The schoolchildren were rehearsing a pageant, and Sarah threw herself into the planning, grateful for the distraction from her growing feelings for Marshall. A week before Christmas, she stayed late at the schoolhouse, putting the finishing touches on costumes for the pageant. The winter darkness had fallen early, and she lit the lamps, working by their golden glow. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the door open. "Working late again, Miss Caldwell?" Sarah looked up with a start to find a man standing in the doorway, not Marshall, but Harold Jensen, Molly's father and one of the school board members. His expression was unpleasant, his eyes slightly unfocused. She could smell the whiskey on him from across the room. "Mr. Jensen," she acknowledged, rising to her feet. "I was just finishing up. If you'll excuse me, I should be getting back to the boarding house." Jensen moved further into the room, blocking her path to the door. "Not so fast. I've been meaning to have a word with you." Sarah's heart began to pound, but she kept her voice steady. "Perhaps tomorrow would be better when you're more yourself," he laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Oh, I'm exactly myself right now. Just Dutch courage making me say what needs saying." He took another step toward her. "We know what you are, Miss Caldwell, a woman with a tainted past teaching our innocent children." Sarah backed away, bumping into the desk behind her. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play innocent with me," Jensen snarled. "Word came through on the stage yesterday, a letter from Boston telling all about your scandalous affair with a married man, how you disgraced yourself and your family." Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? Then why'd you run? Why'd you come all the way out here where nobody knew your shame? He was close enough now that she could see the veins in his reddened eyes. "I want you gone, Miss Caldwell. Gone from this school and gone from this town before you corrupt our children with your loose morals." "Please, Mr. Jensen," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. "Let me explain." "I don't want your explanations," he interrupted, grabbing her arm roughly. "I want your promise that you'll be on the next stage out of Redemption Springs. Take your hands off her." The command came from the doorway where Marshal Reed stood, his expression thunderous. "Now, Jensen." Jensen released Sarah's arm as if burned, turning to face the marshal. "This ain't your business, Reed. This is a school matter." "You assaulting a woman in my town makes it my business," Marshal replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "Go home, Jensen. Sleep it off. We'll discuss this tomorrow when you're sober." For a moment, it seemed Jensen might argue, but something in Marshall's stance must have convinced him otherwise. With a final glare at Sarah, he stumbled toward the door. "This ain't over," he muttered as he passed Marshall. "The board won't stand for her kind teaching our children." When he was gone, Marshall closed the door and turned to Sarah, his concern evident. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Sarah rubbed her arm where Jensen's fingers had dug in. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled. "How did you know to come?" "Mrs. Wilson was worried when you didn't return for supper," he explained, moving closer to examine her arm. "I thought I'd check on you. Good thing I did." Sarah nodded, grateful for his timely arrival. "He knows, Marshall. Someone from Boston sent a letter. Now the whole town will know the truth about me." "What is the truth, Sarah?" he asked gently. "I think it's time you told me." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but concern, and something else, something that gave her the courage to finally speak the words she had kept locked inside for so long. "I was engaged," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "To Thomas Harrington, a banker's son from a good family. I loved him, or thought I did. We were to be married in the spring." Marshall nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I discovered I was with child," she said, the shame of it still raw even after all this time. "I told Thomas, expecting him to move the wedding date forward. Instead, he confessed that he was already married, had been for 2 years, to a woman in another town where his family had business interests." Marshall's expression darkened, but he remained silent, letting her tell her story. "He offered me money to go away quietly to take care of my problem," Sarah continued, unable to meet his eyes now. "I refused. I went to his father instead, thinking he would insist his son do right by me, but he called me a harlot, accused me of trying to trap his son. He threatened to ruin my family if I didn't leave Boston immediately." "And the child?" Marshall asked softly. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "I lost it. The stress, the shame. I began bleeding one night and by morning it was gone. My parents disowned me. I had nowhere to go, no prospects, so when I saw the advertisement for a teacher needed in Redemption Springs." "You saw a chance to start over," Marshall finished for her. Sarah nodded, wiping away tears. "But it seems my past has followed me here after all. By tomorrow everyone will know I'll have to leave." "No," Marshall said firmly, surprising her. "You're not running anymore, Sarah. Not because of lies and half-truths spread by people who don't know the whole story." "But the school board—" "Let me worry about the school board," he interrupted. "Jensen doesn't speak for all of them, and once they hear what really happened—" "I can't bear for everyone to know," Sarah said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "The scandal, the shame." Marshall stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. "There's no shame in being deceived by a man you trusted. The shame belongs to him, not you." His words, spoken with such conviction, broke something inside her. The sobs she had held back for so long tore from her throat, and Marshall pulled her against his chest, holding her as she wept for all she had lost: her child, her family, her reputation. When the storm of tears finally subsided, she became aware of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, steady and strong. She pulled back slightly, embarrassed by her display. "I'm sorry," she murmured, wiping her face with her handkerchief. "Don't be," he replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "You've carried this burden alone for too long." She looked up at him, struck by the tenderness in his gaze. "Why are you helping me? After what I've done, you've done nothing wrong," he interrupted firmly. "And as for why I'm helping you—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind. Because you're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever met. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Caldwell." The declaration left her speechless. She stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. "You can't," she finally whispered. "I'm ruined, tainted." Marshall shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They whispered that you'd been tainted," he said softly. "Then consider me stained too. I don't care what anyone in this town thinks. I care about you." Before she could respond, he lowered his head and kissed her gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck. In that moment, the past seemed to fall away, leaving only the present and the promise of a future she had thought forever denied to her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Marshall rested his forehead against hers. "I won't let them drive you away," he promised. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." For the first time in months, Sarah felt hope bloom in her heart. "Together," she echoed and sealed the promise with another kiss. The following days were a whirlwind of tension and uncertainty. As Sarah had feared, Jensen had wasted no time in spreading his version of her past throughout the town. She endured cold stares and whispered comments as she walked to and from the schoolhouse. Some parents even kept their children home, unwilling to let them be taught by a woman of questionable character. Marshall was true to his word, confronting Jensen and calling an emergency meeting of the school board. Sarah attended, her head held high despite her trembling knees, and told her story just as she had told Marshall. Some of the board members were unmoved, their expressions stony with disapproval, but others seemed sympathetic, particularly Mrs. Henderson, who had championed her from the beginning. In the end, the board reached a compromise. Sarah would be allowed to finish the school term, which ended after the Christmas pageant, at which point her position would be reevaluated. "It's the best we could hope for," Marshall told her afterward as they walked back to the boarding house. "It gives us time." "Time for what?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with defeat. "For them to find more reasons to despise me, for more letters from Boston to arrive with more sordid details." Marshall stopped walking, turning to face her. "Time for them to see the real Sarah Caldwell. The dedicated teacher, the woman who cares deeply for her students, the woman I love." His declaration, spoken openly on the main street where anyone might hear, startled her. "Marshall, please," she murmured, glancing around nervously, "don't make things worse." "I'm not ashamed of how I feel," he said firmly. "And I won't hide it to spare the sensibilities of small-minded gossips." His defiance on her behalf touched her deeply, but also concerned her. "Your position in this town means nothing if I can't stand up for what's right," he interrupted. "And loving you is the rightest thing I've ever done." Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. "You're impossible." "So I've been told," he replied with a grin. "Now, about that Christmas pageant, I hear it's going to be quite the production." The change of subject was a relief, and Sarah launched into a description of the costumes and rehearsals, grateful for the momentary distraction from her troubles. The night of the pageant arrived with a fresh snowfall that transformed Redemption Springs into a scene from a fairy tale. The schoolhouse was filled to capacity with parents, siblings, and townspeople eager to see the children perform. Sarah stood nervously at the back, watching as her students enacted the nativity story with varying degrees of success. To her surprise, many of the parents who had been coldest to her in recent days approached afterward to compliment the performance and thank her for her work with their children. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed into the snowy night, Marshall appeared at her side, his expression unusually serious. "Walk with me," he asked, offering his arm. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the parents still lingering nearby. "People will talk." "Let them," he said with a shrug. "I have something important to discuss with you." Intrigued, Sarah took his arm and allowed him to lead her outside. The snow was falling gently, large flakes catching in her hair and on her eyelashes. Marshall guided her toward the church, which stood dark and silent across the street from the schoolhouse. "Where are we going?" she asked as he opened the church door. "You'll see," he replied mysteriously, ushering her inside. The interior of the church was transformed, lit by dozens of candles that cast a warm, golden glow over the simple wooden pews. A small fire burned in the pot-bellied stove at the back, taking the chill from the air. "Marshall, what is this?" Sarah asked, turning to him in confusion. He smiled, taking both her hands in his. "I spoke with Reverend Phillips this morning. He agreed to meet us here after the pageant." Sarah's heart began to race. For what purpose? Before Marshall could answer, the side door opened and Reverend Phillips entered along with Mrs. Henderson and, to Sarah's surprise, Rebecca Jensen. "I hope you don't mind that I asked them to be here," Marshall said, noting her confusion. "I wanted witnesses." "Witnesses for what?" Sarah asked, though a part of her already knew the answer, could see it in the tender determination of his expression. Marshall lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands, heedless of the shocked gasps from Mrs. Henderson and Rebecca. "Sarah Caldwell, I know we haven't known each other long, and I know your life has been filled with more sorrow than any woman should have to bear. But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never face another hardship alone." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as he continued. "I love you, not despite your past, but including it, because it made you the woman you are, strong, compassionate, and braver than anyone I've ever known. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. Not just his love, but a public declaration of it before witnesses who would ensure the entire town knew by morning. He was staking his reputation on her, aligning himself irrevocably with her tainted past. "Marshall," she finally managed, her voice breaking, "do you know what you're doing?" "What people will say, I know exactly what I'm doing," he replied firmly. "And I don't give a damn what anyone says. You're the woman I want to spend my life with. The only question is whether you want the same." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing nothing but love and certainty. In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marshall's face broke into a radiant smile as he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly while Mrs. Henderson applauded and Rebecca looked on with wide eyes. "Well," Reverend Phillips said when they finally separated, "shall we proceed with the ceremony, or would you prefer to wait?" Sarah blinked in surprise. "Now, but we haven't prepared, there's no—" "Everything's prepared," Marshall assured her. "Mrs. Henderson helped me arrange it all." "Unless you'd rather wait." Sarah looked around at the candlelit church, at the smiling faces of Mrs. Henderson and Reverend Phillips, even at Rebecca Jensen who, despite her husband's opposition, had come to support them. And most of all at Marshall, who was offering her everything she had thought forever beyond her reach. "No," she said firmly, "no more waiting. Let's be married tonight." The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Sarah wore her blue dress, with a hastily gathered bouquet of winter greenery provided by Mrs. Henderson. Marshall had somehow procured a simple gold band that fit perfectly on her finger. They spoke their vows with clear, strong voices that echoed in the quiet church, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Marshall kissed her with such tenderness that fresh tears sprang to her eyes. They were tears of joy, however the first she had shed for that reason in longer than she could remember. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations from their small audience, Marshall led his new wife through the snowy streets toward his home, a modest but comfortable house near the marshal's office. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said as he carried her over the threshold, making her laugh despite her nervousness about what was to come. The house was warm and welcoming, with a fire already burning in the hearth. Marshall had clearly prepared for this possibility, and the thought of his confidence, his certainty in her answer touched her deeply. "Are you hungry?" he asked as he helped her remove her snow-dusted shawl. "I have some stew keeping warm." Sarah shook her head, suddenly shy. "No, That is, I'm not hungry." Marshall's expression softened as he recognized her nervousness. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said gently. "We have all the time in the world." His consideration nearly undid her. "It's not that," she assured him, finding her courage. It's been a long time since anyone has treated me with such tenderness. I hardly know how to respond." Marshall stepped closer, cupping her face in his large hands. "Just be yourself, Sarah, that's all I've ever wanted." Their kiss deepened, and Sarah found herself responding with a passion she had thought long dead. Marshall lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bedroom, where they discovered each other slowly, reverently, their bodies joining in a union as sacred as the vows they had exchanged. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Sarah felt a peace she had not known in years. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Will the school board still force me out?" Marshall's hand stroked her hair soothingly. "Let them try. The marshal's wife can teach school if she wants to. And if they're fool enough to dismiss you, we'll start our own school. I own this house and enough land around it to build whatever we need." Sarah raised her head to look at him, marveling at his determination. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" he smiled, touching her cheek gently. "I've thought of nothing but you since the day you arrived. Everything else is just details." News of their marriage spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire. As expected, reactions were mixed. Some, like Mrs. Henderson and Rebecca Jensen, offered genuine congratulations. Others were openly scandalized by the marshal's choice of bride, especially given the recent revelations about her past. Harold Jensen led the opposition, calling an emergency meeting of the town council to demand Marshall's removal as marshal. The meeting was heated, with accusations flying and tempers flaring. In the end, however, the council voted to retain Marshall, largely due to his record of service and the respect he had earned during his years in Redemption Springs. The school board was another matter. Despite Marshall's position, they voted narrowly to dismiss Sarah from her teaching post, citing her moral unsuitability as the reason. Sarah accepted the decision with outward grace, though it pained her deeply to say goodbye to her students. Many of the children cried, and even some of the parents who had supported her dismissal seemed uncomfortable with the actual moment of separation. True to his word, Marshall began construction on a small schoolhouse on their property as soon as the weather permitted. By spring, word had spread that Mrs. Reed would be offering private education to any children whose parents wished them to attend. To Sarah's surprise and delight, nearly half of her former students enrolled, including Molly Jensen, whose mother brought her over herself in direct defiance of her husband's wishes. "He'll come around eventually," Rebecca told Sarah with a determined set to her jaw. "And if he doesn't, well, my daughter's education matters more than his pride." Life settled into a new pattern. Marshall continued his duties as town marshal while Sarah taught during the day and kept their home in the evenings. They faced occasional snubs and cold shoulders from certain townspeople, but these grew less frequent as time passed and the initial scandal faded from memory. On a warm evening in late May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Marshall noticed Sarah's unusual quietness. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, taking her hand in his. Sarah smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since I arrived in Redemption Springs, how much I've changed." "For the better, I hope," he said, raising her hand to his lips. "Definitely for the better," she agreed. "I came here broken and afraid, carrying so much shame, and now—" "Now," he prompted when she trailed off. Sarah turned to face him fully, her eyes shining with joy and a touch of nervousness. "Now I find myself hoping for things I thought were lost to me forever. Family, children." Marshall's eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "Sarah, are you saying?" She nodded, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "I'm with child, Marshall, due in late autumn, according to Doc Wilson." Marshall let out a whoop of joy that likely could be heard all the way to town, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around the porch before setting her down with sudden carefulness. "Are you all right? Should you be resting? Do you need anything?" Sarah laughed, placing her hands on his chest to calm him. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know." His expression grew serious as he placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This baby will be so loved, Sarah, so cherished." "I promise you that." "I know," she whispered, covering his hand with her own. "That's why I'm not afraid this time, because I have you." As summer turned to autumn, Sarah's body changed with the seasons, her belly growing round with new life. Her small school continued to thrive, though she planned to take a break after the baby's birth, at least until spring. The town's attitude toward her had softened considerably. Whether it was her visible pregnancy, which somehow legitimized her in the eyes of many, or simply the passage of time healing old wounds, she found herself welcomed in places that had once been cold to her. Even Harold Jensen, after months of stubborn opposition, finally acknowledged her with a curt nod when they passed on the street, a small gesture, but significant nonetheless. On a crisp October evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Sarah felt the first pains of labor. Marshall, who had been nervously anticipating this moment for weeks, sprang into action with a mixture of efficiency and panic that would have amused her if she hadn't been so focused on the contractions. He sent for the midwife and Rebecca Jensen, who had become Sarah's closest friend despite the initial opposition from her husband. The two women arrived quickly, shooing Marshall out of the bedroom with firm instructions to boil water and stay out of the way. The labor was long and difficult. Outside the bedroom door, Marshall paced like a caged lion, flinching at every cry of pain from his wife. By dawn, he was nearly frantic, but Rebecca finally emerged with a tired smile. "You have a daughter," she told him. "A beautiful, healthy little girl, and Sarah is doing well, just exhausted." Marshall's legs nearly gave out with relief. He entered the bedroom to find Sarah propped up against the pillows, her face pale but radiant as she cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he approached, her smile weary but joyous. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly. Marshall sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the downy head visible above the blanket. The baby made a small sound, turning slightly toward his touch, and his heart seemed to expand in his chest, making room for this new, overwhelming love. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was thinking we might call her Hope, because that's what she represents for us, for me. Hope for a future I never thought I'd have." "Hope Reed," Marshall said, testing the name. "It's perfect." He leaned forward to kiss his wife gently, then pressed another kiss to his daughter's forehead. "Thank you," he murmured against Sarah's hair, "for giving me everything I never knew I wanted." Sarah leaned into his embrace, cradling their daughter between them. "And thank you," she replied, "for showing me that even the most tainted past can lead to the purest happiness." Word of Hope Reed's birth spread quickly through Redemption Springs. The house soon filled with visitors bearing gifts and well wishes. Even some of those who had been most critical of Sarah in the past came to see the baby, offering awkward but genuine congratulations. As winter settled over the town, the Reed family established new routines centered around their daughter. Marshall took to fatherhood with enthusiasm, often walking the floor with Hope at night to let Sarah rest. Sarah recovered her strength gradually, marveling at how completely this tiny person had changed their lives. One Sunday in December, as they prepared to attend church for Hope's christening, Sarah found Marshall standing by the window, holding their daughter and gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He turned to her with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I was thinking about the day you arrived in Redemption Springs, how frightened you looked stepping off that stagecoach, how brave you were to come all this way alone, seeking a new beginning." Sarah leaned against his side, looking down at their sleeping daughter. "I never imagined I'd find all this. You, Hope, a real home. Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Coming here, facing all the whispers and judgment." Sarah shook her head firmly. "Never. Every difficult moment led me here, to you and our daughter. How could I regret that?" Marshall's free arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close. "They whispered that you'd been tainted," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken on the night he proposed. "But they were wrong. You were always pure of heart, Sarah Reed, and I thank God every day that you're mine." As they stood together, a family united despite all odds, Sarah knew that the whispers would never truly fade. There would always be those who remembered her arrival as a woman with a secret past, who judged her for mistakes made in youth and desperation. But with Marshall's love and their daughter's future stretching bright before them, those whispers no longer held any power over her. The taint of her past had been transformed into something beautiful, a love story that would be told in Redemption Springs for generations to come. The story of a disgraced Eastern lady and the town marshal who declared, for all to hear, "Then consider me stained too." 5 years later, the Reed family had grown to include not only Hope, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's green eyes and her mother's quiet determination, but also 3-year-old twins, Michael and Matthew, who kept their parents constantly on their toes with their boundless energy and curiosity. Sarah's small school had expanded to a proper building at the edge of town, where she now taught alongside 2 other teachers, offering education to any child who wished to attend, regardless of their parents' standing in the community. The controversy surrounding her past had faded to a distant memory, replaced by respect for her dedication to her students and her family. Marshall continued as town marshal, though there was talk of him running for mayor in the upcoming election. Redemption Springs had grown considerably in the past 5 years, with new businesses and families arriving regularly, drawn by the town's reputation for fairness and opportunity. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching their children play in the yard, Sarah felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. She reached for Marshall's hand, finding comfort in his solid presence beside her. "Happy?" he asked, seeming to read her thoughts as he often did. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Sometimes I worry it can't last, that it's too perfect." Marshall squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Nothing's perfect, Sarah. We've had our share of hard times. But we've faced them together, and we always will." She nodded, remembering the difficulties they had overcome, the continued opposition from certain townspeople in the early days of their marriage, the scare during her pregnancy with the twins when they thought she might lose them, the fire that had nearly destroyed their first schoolhouse 2 winters ago. "You know what today is?" Marshall asked suddenly. Sarah thought for a moment, then smiled as realization dawned. 6 years since I arrived in Redemption Springs." 6 years since my life changed forever," he corrected, lifting her hand to his lips. "Best day of my life, seeing you step off that stagecoach, even if I didn't know it at the time. Even with all the trouble I brought with me," she teased, though there was a hint of old insecurity in the question. Marshall's answer was immediate and firm. "Especially with all that. It made us who we are, Sarah. It gave us this life, these children. I wouldn't change a single moment of our journey." As the sun set over the western hills, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Sarah Reed looked at her family, at the life she had built from the ashes of scandal and heartbreak, and knew that Marshall was right. Every whisper, every judgment, every moment of shame and fear had led her here, to this perfect, imperfect life. She had arrived in Redemption Springs seeking exactly that redemption. What she had found instead was something far more precious: acceptance, love, and the courage to embrace her past as an essential part of her present joy. In a town built on second chances, Sarah Reed had found her first real chance at happiness. And in the arms of a man who had looked at her tainted reputation and declared himself willingly stained, she had found the truest definition of love.